Salams from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we're talking about what lies in the way of an end to the South and North Korean conflict. We're talking about a new Harvard report about high tech from China. And we're talking about Israel's plans to double its population in the Golan Heights. First up, South and North Korea, China and the United States have agreed in principle to declare a formal end to the Korean War almost 70 years after the conflict ended in a shaky truce. This is according to South Korean President Moon Jae-in. But he has also conceded that talks on the 1950-53 war were being held back by North Korean objections to present-day US hostilities. Speaking in Canberra on a 4-day visit to Australia, Moon said he believed the four main parties who were involved in this conflict agreed in principle to a peace declaration. But he's added that North Korea is the stumbling block in terms of preconditions for the talks. Prabir, it's a long-running conflict, and Moon is at the end, like you were saying, of his tenure, looking to find a solution. What do you make of his statement coming as it does from Australia?
Of course, any of the statements are to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Right.
He's on foreign soil, he's playing to an Australian gallery. All this you have to take into account. If we talk about the armistice agreement, and we have no peace agreement in South Korea, North Korea, the 38th parallel, which is what divides the two sides, it is just an armistice. So this is the longest running conflict, technically, which has had no peace agreement at the end of it. Why is it so is something that we have to think about, but let's go into that second. The question that you raised is what holds it back. And in that, in fact, South Korea's offer is really after a long set of years in which it's after two presidential terms in which the relations with North had actually worsened. And President Moon, in fact, represents a softening of that peace talk starting, and also internally actually trying to settle a number of issues. So in that sense, President Moon would like to leave the legacy of a lasting peace agreement. Now, the peace agreement, the part that North Korea is supposed to be objecting to, is really what I would take for granted as the initial noise you would make. Initially, when President Moon had proposed it, at that time, the North Korean one minister had said, this is too premature. Of course, they have the hostilities with the United States. There are still sanctions on North Korea, US sanctions, to which also South Korea is a party. So all that is in the backdrop. But if you take concretely what are the signals, that North Korea, in fact, the President Kim Jong's sister, she's pretty high profile in North Korea. She had in fact sanctioned after one of the ministers had rejected it, saying it's premature. She had said it's a welcome measure, but South Korea needs to stop A, B, C, D. That's why I said it's really the preliminary moves which anybody would make before you sit down to talk. But the real stumbling block is not North and South Korea. It's really South Korea's military relationship with the United States and a concomitant part of the armistice agreement which the United States and South Korean government has, which essentially subordinates South Korea's military to the United States. And I think that is the bigger part of the problem. And if there is going to be a peace treaty, then what happens to that agreement is as important as the relationship between North and South. And I think that's something that people have to understand, that it's not simply North and South, but it's really the United States. China has been a guarantor of peace for North Korea. But that was really 1953 we are talking about, that war. But China and the United States confronted each other in the Korean Peninsula. Now what we are talking about is a completely different scenario. But as far as the US and South Korean military relationship goes, that doesn't seem to have changed since the Korean War or even during the Korean War. And I think that's something North Koreans should also relate to when they talk about peace discussions.
Absolutely. And so since you did get into that, a little bit about what the US's sort of strategic or military objectives are of being present in South Korea and having this sort of relationship with the South Korean military.
At that point of time, it was clear that they saw it also as a pressure point against China. But if you take the nature of the relationship, it's a very, what would be called a unique relationship, if you will, which subordinates South Korea's military completely to the United States military. Now, that's not something which an independent country would want to have. I don't think there is any precedent in which an independent country today has subordinated its military forces to a foreign country completely.
Right.
But the agreement that was reached after the armistice agreement or during that was that the command of the joint South Korean and United States armies would be by US. The United States would militarily be the commander. Whoever was the US guy would be the commander-in-chief, and they therefore would have the right to decide whatever they want militarily over the South Korean military forces. Now, this was supposedly changed, and there was a 1978, I think, agreement which said this is only during wartime.
Right.
But effectively, it still means that it can declare that there is a war, it is wartime, because armistice is the only one. So if there is an armistice, the war still continues.
It's still on. Essentially just a ceasefire.
Just a ceasefire. So effectively, therefore, to say under wartime conditions really doesn't take much away from the earlier agreement, which had subordinated the South Korean military completely to the US military. So you can argue that they are trying to rework the relationship. There are some military exercises where the South Korean military has also commanded the joint exercise, though in a limited sense. But it doesn't take away from the fact there is an agreement on the ground which subordinates the South Korean army to the US army. And therefore, US still, I would say, militarily commands the South Korean forces, and that does not give full independence, therefore, to South Korea from the United States. So in that sense, it's still a subordinate power. And this is something which is not of any concern to the rest of the world. But in South Korea, it has always been an issue which has not gone down well with the people. And therefore, there is a subterranean or not so subterranean feeling against this agreement that this needs to change and South Korea should assert its independence completely. In which case, then North Korea and South Korea can have an equation, sitting down and resolving their relationships independent of the United States. But as long as this military agreement continues, I don't think that is really true.
All right. Thanks very much, Prabir. Right. Next up, a recent report by Harvard University highlights the massive advances China has made in multiple fields of cutting-edge technology over the past decades. Published last week by Harvard's Belfer Center, the report warns that prevailing attitudes against China in the United States are problematic. It notes that China has displaced the US as the world's top high-end manufacturer, producing some 250 million computers, 25 million cars, and 1.5 billion smartphones in 2020 alone. While in some fields China is already at the head of the class, based on current trajectories, it's likely to overtake the US in other key high-tech fields as well. The Harvard report reiterated the views of Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, that China is now a full-spectrum peer competitor of the United States in artificial intelligence. Baba Sinha is NewsClick's go-to guy for all questions related to technology. Baba, you've taken a look at the report. What are the subjects or the areas that it covers?
So the report basically says in the key emerging technologies, right, which is AI, 5G, semiconductors, biotechnology, and green energy. So these are considered the key technologies of the next generation, right? And they are saying that in each of these key technologies, either China has already caught up with the US and surpassed the US in some cases, and in some of these technologies, for example, in semiconductors, it's still behind, but the anticipation is in next 10 to 15 years, it will catch up. Right, so I think why the report is making the buzz is that U.S. Dominance over the last, let's say, a few decades was based on its capture of the technology space. Right, so it was the premier creator of technology and technology patents, and it kind of that gave it a competitive advantage to the rest of the world. Now that is now starting to get seriously challenged by China, and that's why the report is making such big news.
So then the obvious, I guess, next question is for a bit of historical context. How is, while the US was taking this lead over the last, let's say, 4 or 5 decades, China was focused on manufacturing. And how has that laid the foundation then for this sort of age of innovation that we're seeing?
So even going further back, right? So US came to take the lead after the Second World War, right? Basically, after the Second World War, the industrialized, the rest of the industrialized world, which is Western Europe and Japan, their economies were effectively destroyed. So their production capacity was destroyed. US became the manufacturer of the world, okay? And with that came the super profits, right? And they then took those super profits and invested it in technology, effectively semiconductors. And a lot of it at that time was driven by a Cold War paranoia, nuclear umbrella, the military industrial complex and all that. But effectively it meant putting in huge amounts of funds, government funds into computing and in semiconductors, which effectively built the lead of the US. They came so, by the 1970s, 80s, they had become so far ahead of the rest of the world that they were effectively running on that investment that they had done in the
war years,
40, immediately after the war. So that's the interesting parallel, right? They had the manufacturing base that created the funds to invest in technology and which made them the leader. Now, we all know that from the 80s onwards, the US primarily, but the rest of the West also, has outsourced its manufacturing, and China has increasingly become the manufacturing powerhouse. It's the factory of the world, right? And with that came the funds. And then China has, in turn, started investing in technology, and now naturally it has caught up. All right, and so if you look at the attitude of the West, at around 2000, by the time China had already become reasonably big, but China was looked at as a low-end manufacturer of low-end goods, which will never become the industrial powerhouse, right? Because they said China was too big and too poor to become a mid-level country.
Right.
By 2010, China was producing most of the consumer goods, right? It had become the factory, at least for the low-end manufacturing goods. And interestingly, in 2010, in Business Harvard Review, there was an article by a China expert called William Kirby, who said that China is basically a country of rule-bound rote learners who can only imitate and not innovate. I mean, if you think about it, it's not just they didn't predict the rise of China. It's deeply racist, right? Though that innovation is only capable by the white people, right? Now, like key people within the tech industry, like Eric Schmidt, like you mentioned, right? Google's CEO, one of Google's founders, he has said effectively that China will catch up, has caught up or will catch up, and that within the next decade, that China will be ahead of the US in technology, right? And saying, given that China's economy, its investments in research and development, better research, more deployment of technologies, key technologies, and better computing infrastructure, they will surpass the US. And that is now triggering this angst in the American policy establishment, which has led to the trade, they initially started as trade wars, but now it is very clear that they're specifically tech wars. There is a deliberate attempt to slow down China and cut off its access to some of these key technologies so that they can't naturally take over the technology lead which Americans have.
If I can ask you one last question, for the rest of us, particularly those of us living in the global south, what does this mean in terms of this tech race between the US and China?
Well, what it means is that if you look at for the last few decades, the advances in technology came from America and American companies. Even now, when you think of, okay, what are the top 5 tech names, you think of Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, right? But now, for example, the top 7 tech companies in artificial intelligence, 4 are American, 3 are Chinese.
Right.
So Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu are at par in AI with Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, right?
And perhaps with greater numbers than the US has in terms of users also, perhaps.
So see, China has many advantages. One is that it's still a growing economy, right? So it has funds, and those funds it deploys into its educational system. It produces 4 times the number of stem cell graduates than US does. It has a bigger population. Sorry, not stem cells, STEM graduates. Yeah. It produces twice the number of STEM PhDs. In terms of the market, right? China consumes 60% of all semiconductors produced in the world, right? It in terms of financial technologies, right? Like WeChat Pay has 900 million users, while Apple has 44 million users, right? So in research, the investments in research and development, their deployed base of technology users, they have a much bigger internal market. And in terms of infrastructure, for example, 87% of all 5G users are in China, right? And those 5G users are going to generate data. Those 900 million WeChat Pay users are going to generate data. That is going to power their next generation of AI apps, and which is going to it then becomes a natural self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So the only thing which the US has is that China still lags behind US in semiconductor technology, right? It's still 1 or 2 generations behind the US. And so the US is trying to effectively block China's access to the key semiconductor technologies, which kind of underpins all of this. But the fact is, because China is the biggest market, many of the technology companies themselves are pushing back, because cutting off China also means cutting off their biggest markets and the profits, which they will use to reinvest in technology, right? Absolutely. So it's not that easy to cut off China. And so that is the dilemma which US has, and the growth which like China sees. For the rest of the world, instead of a monopoly of technology, now you see a duopoly, right? Clearly, we are getting to that phase.
Right. Thanks so much, Baba.
Thanks.
And finally, Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is advancing the establishment of a new zoning board with broad powers and no public representatives in a bid to expedite development and construction in the Golan Heights. The proposal is part of a program announced in October and slated for submission to their cabinet for approval this month to double the population of the Golan Heights by the end of the decade. For more on this, I spoke earlier to Abdul. Right. So, Abdul, first up, what is this zoning board, and what is Israel's plan for the Golan Heights?
The plan basically was announced last month. Now they are the meeting, the so-called meeting, they are saying the celebratory meeting of the cabinet, which has to happen in Golan Heights. It had to happen last month. Now it is basically delayed. So it is happening most probably this month. The date is still not out, as far as I remember. So basically, Bennett cabinet is planning to expand the settlements in the Golan Heights, the illegal settlements in the Golan Heights. Given the fact that the Golan Heights is an occupied territory, their plan is to kind of build 7,000 new settlements in that region, in which currently there are, say, 50 to 55,000 people in the Golan Heights. Right. Their plan is to increase it to 1 lakh plus. So that is basically, and then as if now there is a plan of a proper township, which will have its own electric power station and other basic amenities which is required in an urban setup. So all this will be developed, despite the fact that there are environmental concerns raised, despite the fact that there are illegal, the legality of the entire process is under question. And even today, there was an editorial in Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, saying that Israel should not go ahead with the project, given the fact that it is an occupied territory. But given the larger, I think, Bennett's attempt to outdo his predecessor Netanyahu in every right-wing attempts. So I think this is what it is. The so-called national interest, which Bennett was referring to, is basically nothing to do with national interest, but his attempt to kind of gain some kind of political mileage, popularity among the right-wing groups in Israel.
Right. So in that context, Abdul, give us sort of a brief on the history of the Golan Heights and what part it plays in the regional power dynamic.
I think this is a very well-known history that Golan Heights was occupied by Israel in 1967 war. Since that occupation, thousands of Syrians who were living in that area were expelled and they had to migrate out of the region. Today, there is a small population, still Syrian population is still there, mostly Druzes, around 22,000 people. But apart from that, there are other illegal Israeli settlements are there. Israel annexed Golan Heights in 1981. Saying that this is, despite the fact that there was UN Resolution 242, which says that this is an occupied territory and it has to go back to Syrians, as like other Palestinian territories, which has to go back to Palestine. But Israel nonetheless annexed it illegally. And since then, it has basically built what we call the creating facts on the ground, so that at the last moment, if there is a peace negotiation where the policy of land for peace, which they followed for a very long time. And now, after this plan, we don't know what will be the fate of that policy itself. But so far, they followed that policy of creating facts on the ground so that they can claim maximum land when there is a negotiation happening, claiming that this is Jewish territory and so on and so forth. What scholars call, or the people who observe Palestine call Judaization process, which is happening in other occupied territories. Israel has been doing it in the Golan Heights also. And this plan basically is related to that. Despite the disputed status of the Golan Heights, during the Trump administration, United States became the first country to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the territory. So since then, basically Israelis are trying to basically take further steps to Judaize that Golan Heights, which basically will be, as Harret's editorial was also referring, it will make the peace process anytime in future very difficult to execute.
Right. Thanks so much, Abdul, for that. All right, that's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. For more on these stories and everything else, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and follow us on all the regular social media platforms. That's all we have on the show today. We'll be back same place, same time tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.